Emotional wellness is key, and our nervous system is super important to listen to and understand. So, why do we react the way that we do, and how do we regulate our emotions and our nervous system? That's what we're going to be reviewing in several episodes today. We're going to talk about the first one, how our body affects our mental health, and honestly, how our mental health affects our body. And then next, we're going to talk about emotional overload and how that affects our nervous system. And third, we're going to talk about the head disconnect. If you were like me, you were raised in a culture, and honestly, this still exists and persists today, about how emotions are bad and we kind of have to disconnect and not use them and kind of wonder what they're even for. And they're super helpful. Emotions are really the keys to understanding a lot about ourselves and what's really going on, and they're very important to understand. And then lastly, we're going to talk about from diagnosis to empowerment. As you guys know, if you've been listening to the podcast, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And sometimes people get diagnosed and it's kind of a relief. For me, it became more of an entrapment and something that like you're stuck with this. And that's not true. And medical community and the whole community as a whole has gone past that in a lot of ways. So it's good to know how we can actually take back our mental health and what that looks like and live every day brighter. So enjoy. Have you had some mental health challenges, or have you struggled with mental illness or been diagnosed with a mental illness? You're not alone. I have too. Let's talk about this. So with this, I'm just sharing my experience and what I've learned and some resources that you might find interesting, or somebody else may, one of your friends or family may find it interesting. So again, mental health is a passion of mine because of my own experience. And with my own experience, I was diagnosed 22 years ago with bipolar when I was in the psych ward. And what was going on again, and you can listen to the first episode for the full story, is I had undiagnosed Hashimoto's. I had just taken an antibiotic. I had just had a baby. And the big key is I was also in a destructive marriage. So all of those kind of collided. And basically that lack of sleep and speaking out against my marriage and the conflict that wasn't allowed, because that was a big thing in that marriage at the time, is, couldn't deal with any conflict without being stonewalled and ignored. And basically it just created a perfect storm, and I had mental challenges and didn't sleep. Ended up in a psych ward with a bipolar diagnosis. I think the very interesting thing, and it even bothered me at the time, I'm like, you guys don't seem to care that I'm in this destructive relationship, and you don't seem to care about any of this other stuff. And they really didn't at the time. It was more about like, let's just get you on medication and kind of isolate your mind, body, spirit, and all of that, which is kind of how Western medicine works, as far as they want to separate your mind and your body and all of that. And that's really not how we work as people. We're really mind, body, spirit, circumstances, trauma, all of that. That is our whole human being. That's just all of us. And it's very hard to separate because each of those have a factor on the other. And so I'm going to talk about how each of them have a factor on our mental challenges. And personally, I don't know, I have a hard time saying, mental illness. I'm like, I think all of us, you give us enough pressure or stress or whatever, and I think all of us are going to have one sort of mental illness diagnosis or something. I remember hearing, if you went to Ukraine right now where the war is, about every single one of them would be manifesting a mental illness. And so it's very interesting just realizing that we all have a way that our mind is just not, gets to a point and it's just not going to work well, given how we are doing as a whole person. And so it's just, I call it mental challenge, and I definitely remember how mentally challenged I was. And so I have lots of compassion on all of that, and know that that is something that I need to be aware of and know my body and and watch out for. So that's really good to know. So again, our whole body can be, affect us mentally. You can't just separate mind, body, emotions. And so let's talk about the body. I am so thankful. I feel like there's so much more information on this than there was 22 years ago when I got my misdiagnosis, is about gut health. Like I mentioned, I had just taken an antibiotic and I could just tell a switch had shifted just like that. It was very strange. And it's much more understood now because we realize that our gut health is super impactful on our brain health. Super impactful. In fact, 95% of our serotonin, which is our good feeling hormone, comes from our gut. And our gut and our brain are communicating. So having great gut health is super important. Things that can sabotage that is like how we eat. It can, what type of, antibiotics. It could be, just like if we're stressed, that also hurts our gut. And so it was interesting as I tried just healing and getting better. and getting my body healthier. Being in a chronically stressed marriage relationship was very hard on my body and my gut. So it was very interesting to see that whole interaction. Another big thing about our body and our brains is hormones. So again, at the time when I got the diagnosis, I was having hyperthyroidism, and they missed catching that I had Hashimoto's, but oh my goodness, I could eat and eat and eat and eat. My hair was falling out, my legs are giving out, and I was just getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And I just felt like I was on overdrive and not sleeping. And, later they thought I had thyroid cancer, pulled out my thyroid and said, oops, you have Hashimoto's and you've had it since you were 13. But I definitely could tell I was having thyroid issues, but it didn't get captured and diagnosed at the time when it really needed to at that point. So just all of those things, our gut, our habits, our serotonin in our gut, our hormones, all of that can affect our body, which affects our mind. So it's very interesting, that connection. A lot of other things is just our life, our emotions, like how well are we able to manage our emotions. And I don't like the word manage. I think it's more processing our emotions, because managing is like almost looking at like, oh, you naughty little kids, we just got to keep you in line. Whereas I feel like emotions are information, and we just need to try to listen to what they're telling us. And so, and learning to process that, to feel it, to understand it, to like really to process it. Because like they say, what you resist persists. And you can't just suppress it because it comes out other ways. And so that's not good. And for me, it came out in a lot of physical pain and, physical challenges with my immune system and even the Hashimoto's. So that was very interesting. But so processing emotion and the circumstances we are in are huge. So for me, like not having a home that was emotionally safe, that just felt like a place I could relax, was very, very stressful on my body. It was very stressful on me mentally. And not having an ability to resolve conflict. Also, past traumas, that can very much affect our mental health. I just think that's powerful in the sense of that can have an impact even if we aren't even aware of it. It has a way of kind of like if we blocked it off in a closet in a dark little, it has a way of creeping up. So just going through and doing the work to deal with those, and it's a lot of hard work. One thing I did was EMDR through a counselor, and that was super helpful to get the trauma part of my brain and deal with the trauma and put it in the historical part of my brain. And EMDR I thought was a super helpful tool, and there's a lot of really great tools. I know like meditation and tapping and just breathing. I know for my husband, like learning how to breathe in a way that changed his brain from fight or flight and soothed it was probably the most powerful tool he learned. And again, to do that, you just take a deep breath in and then you just breathe out way longer than you breathe in, and you do that for 2 minutes, and it actually biologically changes your brain from going from fight or flight more into letting your cognitive part of your brain, your frontal cortex, start thinking again. So that's a really powerful tool as well. And again, emotions like anxiety or depression or those things, those can be information. Those can be very helpful. And again, learning keys to process our emotions is really helpful. I will tell you, so after I got the diagnosis, because usually with bipolar people, they end up cycling with highs and lows all the time, even on medication. And I didn't have that, which was probably the first key to my misdiagnosis. And finally, the psychiatrist I think we should get you off medication. And so she tapered me off. And what I learned when I got off medication is, whoa, I was feeling my emotions to a huge, much bigger degree, and how the medication had really buffered that down, which can be very useful for a time. But I had to learn a whole new way to process my emotions. I'm like, whoa, these are really big and bright feelings now. And that's why in the Unravel notebook that I made, that second half of it is called the Barf notebook. And what that was the process I used to just kind of learn to process my emotions and really let them tell me information. And really that was just again a process of barfing out my emotions, my thoughts, and then really kind of sorting them out, asking myself questions like, what are the facts, what are the stories, what are the triggers, what are the boundaries, what are the things I kind of need to have compassion and with love look at the situation, and then sort it out, decide how I want to, look at this, reframe it, and then plan it out. What do I want to do next? Do I need to have a conversation with someone? Do I need to kind of reprocess pattern, belief, or anything like that, and that kind of just was a way for me to learn to manage my emotions and thoughts. So that Barf notebook process. And then really ask yourself, what is the next best step for me with, whether it be just, a processing, a talking to someone, or do I need a specialist? I would say number 3, if you do need a specialist, you can look at, depending on what you need assistance with. I really feel like if it's having to do with mental health, that if you're wanting to get some assistance in that, really looking at an integrative medical professional, a holistic psychiatrist, a naturopath, and there's a lot of different other people. I'm all about, like, if you want counseling, you can go to betterhelp.com and being able to get counseling online, really having a place. But I would just ask yourself, what is your next best step? And we're all growing mentally and emotionally, and that's part of this life. I find that our bodies or our minds are like kind of a house, and we're like, for me, I was like cleaning out one room at a time and getting it ordered and going throughout and my body and being able to do that and getting connected as far as improving my physical health, my emotional health, my mental health, and creating a surroundings that's supportive to all of that. And I just, and a lot of that is just done in community and with love. And so that's one reason why I do this podcast and have this community. I say grow 1% a day. I think we all can do that. And I love doing that together. And I believe in you. Let your light shine. Are you feeling stuck in with love, wealth, or peace? Well, you're not alone. Often it's a subconscious belief holding you back. That's why I combined life coaching and hypnotherapy together, so you can break through what's been keeping you stuck. Life coaching helps you shift your mindset, while hypnotherapy works deep within to reprogram limiting beliefs and memories. It's fast, it's effective, typically one session of each, and I have a few openings left. Are you ready for a change? Visit livebrighter.info and book your free consultation and see if this approach is right for you. See you then. Is your nervous system speaking to you? Well, let me tell you a story about me recently, and my nervous system really spoke to me. So just recently, my niece, who was 15, passed away from a viral infection, and it was quite the surprise. And I did some things during the funeral to support my family that I knew would be very difficult to me. And I wouldn't normally do, but I felt like I wanted to do, knowing that I would take some time to recover. Then I planned a trip to our house in Colombia, South America, where we've just finishing our house there. And it was supposed to be this greatly relaxing time, but instead the pool wasn't done. There were people there all the time. My husband got burned, 2nd degree, 3rd degree burn on the way down from some coffee. And he wasn't doing well. So the whole trip, instead of being relaxing to my nervous system, super heightened it. And on the way back, too much information, but I started getting like chronic diarrhea. And that was a big red flag. So let's talk about nervous system dysregulation. So the nervous system dysregulation, I'm familiar with and we talk about, but I was not listening to the subtle signs of my nervous system speaking to me. And it's so important to do this. And then I basically just gave it a big dose of emotions and a big dose of stuff. So it really brought things to awareness that, maybe I was just trying to tolerate. But this started actually for me a while ago. So let's give you a little history, my life. So I'm a realtor 90% of my time. I'm also a life coach, I'm a podcaster, have a nonprofit for women getting out of domestic abuse, have some rentals, have 4 kids, was just married a few years ago, remarried and traveling. And, people would say to me, how do you do it all? And I kept thinking, it doesn't seem like much, but even then I started noticing some symptoms. And what I really noticed was probably about a year ago. I started noticing some brain fog, some concentration, and I'm like, oh, it's my hormones, which, it was somewhat hormones, but it was also my nervous system starting to speak to me. I also noticed that I started this fidgeting thing. Like if I were just to sit still, I'd be like moving my hands or moving my foot or clicking. There was always something moving on me. And I'm like, that's kind of interesting. I think my nervous system is a little heightened. But I kept letting it go. Then, I was having some difficulty sleeping and some neck pain and some headaches. But none of these were happening regularly. So it wasn't also just happening all at once. So I didn't really catch on, to be honest. And then I've spoken to you about my nightmares, which that should have been a sign that I'm in a triggered nervous system. And then I started having chronic thumb pain of all things. And I'm like, oh, that's just from working out. But it's always in the back of my mind. I'm like, I think my nervous system is trying to tell me something. And then when Ariel died, it just flooded me and it became very apparent that my nervous system was very unhappy with me. So let's talk about like how the nervous system works. As a lot of you know, we've got our fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And basically, if our nervous system is running too high, and that can be from a lot of things we've talked about, like it could be from past unprocessed emotions and unprocessed stories that are still running in the background, causing a lot of challenges for us, or it could be our current stressors, or it could be, just our personality. And for me, I've worked a lot on my past. We've talked about that a lot in this podcast, how I've worked through a lot on my past and rewritten the stories and done my healing on that. But my current stressors were definitely impacting me. And I noticed, looking back, that I was hanging out with people like probably 80% of the time, the people that I mostly hung out with were very nervous system dysregulated. They were both struggling with depression and some serious things. And I was completely unaware of it because I tend to just be at a higher frequency and just a happy person and all of that. And then when my nervous system it was not happy, wanted to burn all the bridges down, wanted to burn my life down, I realized as my body was reacting to certain people and certain things that I was not living in alignment to, what I believe as far as surrounding ourselves with people of like-minded and building us up. And I wasn't attending to what my body was telling me. So it made me, and I think that chronic diarrhea, I'm like, oh my goodness, something's really wrong. So that one definitely stood out and I needed a little shake up. And that's been really good. And we've talked about this mind-body connection and how important it is to be connected to our bodies. And it's just interesting because I've talked about many years ago. Actually, I guess it was only 3 years ago. I had chronic neck pain and shoulder pain. It was my right neck and my right shoulder, which had a reason for having this chronic pain because I had a gymnastics injury. But I really felt like it could have been emotional. And then I had, run into Dr. Starno's stuff and his book, The Mind Body Prescription, and really used that. And I've spoken about that on the podcast, really used that to unleash my rage regarding my previous marriage because anger was not allowed. So rage was definitely not allowed. And honestly, I just released it in my head, a lot of cussing. That is usually helpful to me when I'm really upset in my head. And I haven't had chronic neck or shoulder pains. And again, till just recently, I started getting them back. And that's why it was like, okay, something's going on. You're not in alignment. That's not good. Because it's so fascinating. Our body, our minds, would rather us sometimes not feel strong emotions, like strong base emotions, like fear and rage and dread and despair and grief and all of those things. It's like, oh my goodness, that's gonna destroy you. I need to give you pain to distract you. And that can come out in like headaches, neck pain, anxiety, depression, or all of my weird things that were going on. My thumb, my neck, my shoulders, all sorts of stuff that was going on. And it likes to do that to distract us from feeling our base emotions and feeling our feelings. And so really processing our emotions is kind of like, and that's why I called it the Barf notebook. When you throw up, you usually feel better. So it's more just getting it out. And a lot of people are like, well, what is that going to do am I going to have to change my life and da-da-da-da? And am I going to have to, is this going to make me have a nervous breakdown? I mean, all sorts of things. But really that's just resistance. And you don't have to do anything. You just have to feel your feelings, which we are made to. I think in the United States, we've really disconnected our brain and our bodies and our emotions. And that is very destructive to us and creates all sorts of symptoms that we've talked about. So it's interesting that I'm experiencing this in a new and different way in real time and that you guys get to hear all about it. So it's all working out the way it's supposed to. Anyway, so I want you to just check in with yourselves and be like, is there a chronic pain that you've been experiencing? Is there anxiety? Do you have a hard time just being still and being at peace? And if there's anything that comes up to you, this is another good question. Is there something in your past that you're reminded of frequently in your brain? Your subconscious wants to pop it up. Those are things that need processing, and you can do it. So really just process it. I really like what Nicole says as far as process it for 20 minutes, just barf it out, and then give yourself 10 minutes of meditation or something that's supportive of you. And just so you know, we all have fear and grief and rage and all of those things, and it's okay. It doesn't make us bad or wrong or anything. And some personalities, like I tend to be more of a type A person, we tend to have it a little bit more because we tend to overfunction. And that was something that I really noticed is like when I'm looking back at my nervous system, it's like, wow, I was overfunctioning for some people, and that was not okay for me. And that was, that's been another enlightenment for me. And I tend to do that. And that's something I have to watch out for, that right now I am learning from. So let's call it that way. So we're going to talk more about how to regulate our nervous systems and the processes. Really, I just encourage you to regularly just barf it out. Barf out those emotions and then support yourself with meditation, something that's supportive, reading scripture, something that's going to support you. And so breathing is very helpful. In fact, that's another thing is if you notice yourself shallow breathing, then you're probably in some sort of fight flight response. So really just taking deep belly breaths in and then breathing out slowly is really helpful. And then, if you want to do what I did, mentally burn your life down and then recreate it, it doesn't mean you have to take action right away. But in my case, I did need to take action because that was the part that it's not serving me. Is some of these things I did know, and I knew it had a cost, but I didn't realize how much it was costing me. And so I've really had to recreate my life so that it allows me to rest in this season as I recover from my niece's passing and just supporting my family in that way. So if anything came up for you during this podcast, I just want you to write it down somewhere, just a sticky note, anything, write it down and take that to your barfing journaling practice. And honestly, I feel like I repeat this a lot, but that is one of the most supportive things we can do for ourselves is create a practice of honesty with ourselves and really, create a practice of reprocessing our traumas and letting it become our treasures and our, stepping stones. And it is a process. It's hard, but it's also very hard to be nervous system dysregulated, have pains, coming and going, or chronic anxiety, or all sorts of things, or depression, all the things that an overstimulated, unhappy nervous system likes to do. So it's a good heart to do the work. And I support you, and you can do it. So let's just end with a deep breath in and breathe out slowly. And take a deep breath in and breathe out slowly. Make it a great day. I believe in you. Our emotional cups can get full without us really even being aware of it. But when our emotional cups get full, we can react rather than respond. We can be fatigued. We can feel burdened. We have struggle with sleep. We can have physical symptoms. And that's why I have the free Barf notebook page for you. And it's a simple process done regularly where you're barfing out your thoughts, sorting them out, and planning them out. And it's a wealth of healing in that. So go ahead and check the link and have access to that free Barf notebook process. Live brighter every day. Just the head. That was the third reason why I didn't even know I was in an abusive marriage for 20 years, is I was completely disconnected from my body and my emotions, and it was just the head that was functioning. So I had a unique combination where I had a husband at the time that was Asperger-ish, and I didn't even know that actually until we were separated. And then myself, as a kind girl, I was overly focused on the thoughts, feelings, and emotions of others and outwardly focused all the time. Another term for that is also called high-functioning codependency, and I was a pro. So between those two interacting things where I had a husband at the time who was completely disconnected as well and didn't believe in intuition and feelings or anything, and then every time I would bring up anything to talk about, any conflict, I would be shut down. And when I mean shut down, I would be ignored. So I'd be ignored for 6 days, not touched, not really talked to, just have to say the bare minimum. If I bring it up again, ignored another 6 days. And that was the pattern that was super destructive to my body. Because for me, as a highly relational person, that was incredibly stressful and I felt very isolated. I felt like I was in the high security prison where I was being isolated all the time emotionally from my partner. And for me, marriage was about being married to your best friend and having a connection, and there was not a connection. Very stressful on my body. But rather than listening to my emotions and my body, I didn't. I used to say things like, just forgive and love, things like that. But what happens is, let's talk about emotions. Emotions are vibrations, feelings in our body, and they either get talked about or they get acted out or they do some damage. They don't just go away. So it's really important to understand that. And so what I was doing was suppressing all of those emotions and ignoring them, and it had a huge result on my body. For me, I had a weakened immune system, autoimmune challenges, hormone imbalances, ear infections, just one thing after the other. But rather than listening to my body and saying, hey, body, what are you telling me? I chose to ignore it and tell my body what to do, and that we were on this route and we're going for the end, and that's all that mattered. So it's interesting that we have this disconnection here in America. And that's a lot of us, all we know, but that's actually really different than a lot of places. For example, Western medicine is very, you got your body, your mind, and your spirit, and then let's treat them all, differently. And the spirit, is just for the spiritual people and for the church, and your body and your mind are, we just treat the body, but they're very immersed and very connected. Eastern medicine and naturopathic medicine understands that a lot more, and they're looking for the root causes. And even in the Bible talks about heart, soul, mind, and spirit. But actually in that whole society, they believe that all that was one. And there wasn't that distinction that we try to work with today, or we assume that we have today. So let's talk about body wisdom. What is that? It's basically listening to our body and what it's telling us. And then also, getting emotionally connected with ourselves. That's listening to our emotions and what they're telling us. And those are all very connected with our physical systems, our spiritual parts of us. Like all of that is so interwoven. So how do you get connected to your body? Really, you can do something as easy as like pausing several times a day and just asking your body, or finding out what stresses it's feeling or how it's feeling, and really getting connected with your body. I just ignored my body. And then now, even with medicine, we're finding this gut-brain connection, because there's so much connection between what our body is doing, and stress really impacts our gut and just the microbiome, the microbes there, the healthy ones and the unhealthy ones. And that really affects our brains. For me, that had a really dramatic impact, because during the most stressful time in my marriage, which was like, it was all stressful, but there were 2 bouts that were extra stressful after about a 5-year, a more severe emotional abuse. And at that time, the first time it happened, I not only had a baby, had an undiagnosed Hashimoto's, but I took an antibiotic and messed up my gut health, and I felt a huge difference with just my brain working and how it was functioning. So very much affects everything. So for me, I was being emotionally challenged in my marriage. And like I said, 5 years into it, I had a baby and then had the undiagnosed Hashimoto's and the other things going on. The weird thing is just how my body was reacting to all of this stress. So it had gotten so bad where I couldn't even keep myself warm anymore. And my legs stopped working, where it was hard to walk. And it was very, very challenging how my body was responding to all this stress. So I first got awakened to how big this connection is, especially with mental illness and the impact of that, I would call it mental challenges, is with the book Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, MD. And he's a psychiatrist, and he really got into just how our body responds to stress and emotional stress and psychological and abuse, and how that impacts our mind. He made a very interesting connection in the book about how even the medication I was on for bipolar was fabulous for keeping yourself in abusive marriages, because it was like so dumbing down like your emotions and experience, and kind of putting you in a survival mode in and of itself, that you really couldn't deal with a whole lot other than that. And that was definitely my experience. And the cool thing is our responsibility. So Jesus says and God says that we are supposed to love others as we love ourselves. And so to love ourselves, that means we are the first ones responsible to take care of our physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, all of our well-being. That is our job and our responsibility. And that doesn't get delegated to anybody else. And that's really powerful. So just getting in touch with your physical and your feelings and all of that is super important. Another thing I had a hard time was being in touch with my feelings. So the feeling wheel or the emotion wheel is super helpful. And that is like when you're experiencing a feeling and you don't have a word for it, having this feeling wheel, which basically divides up words, anger, like in the center of the wheel, you've got anger, sadness, and as you go out, it gets more specific. And being able to identify feelings and emotions at a deeper level, and then being able to connect why are we feeling that is really important for our well-being, super important. So loving yourself is listening to your body, listening to your emotions, being honest with yourself. And another way to do this is through what I've talked about in the Barf notebook. And that's, again, the 3-step process of barf it out, sort it out, and plan it out. And just taking that time to really do that inner work. My thoughts are just stretch yourself, grow yourself, know yourself 1% a day. Deepen yourself. And you will be amazed at what you can do in a year. It's amazing. I'm offering some free pages of the Unravel notebook to help support you along the journey and to correlate with this week's episode. So look for the link and enjoy. Have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness? Or have you had some mental health challenges? You're not alone. I have. I was diagnosed at 28 with bipolar. And most of us in our lifetime will struggle with some sort of mental health issue. So let's talk about it. It's really hard because there's potential of shame and frustration wrapped around mental illness, which doesn't need to be there. And I think it's improving so much, and I'm very grateful for that. And I want to just share what I've learned from just my own experience. First of all, as a precursor note, this is not an episode to say, get off medication. There should be no shame in being on medication and the benefits it's having for you. So please don't get that from this episode and just have gratitude for the medication. And so let's talk about the many things that affect our mental health. So in Western society, we have a very black and white boxed approach to mental illness. And basically, psychiatrists use the DSM-5 to diagnose a mental illness based on symptoms. There's a couple challenges with that. First of all, it's based on just the symptoms. It doesn't take into account what we're going to be talking about today, and that's the many different things that affect our mental health. And second of all, I think that's really challenging is when you have that stamp of, hey, you got diagnosed as bipolar, it kind of follows you all of your life, which is very strange because it doesn't need to be that way. Strep isn't like that. Other things aren't like that. And it doesn't have to be something that will affect our whole entire lives. So it's something to just be aware of that as well. So what are the things that affect our mental health that a lot of psychiatrists and doctors don't take into account? And I will say a precursor that there is a lot more expansion in this area, and we'll talk about a lot of different doctors and resources that are more holistic. But in general, they don't take into account these 11 things. So let's talk about it. First of all, they don't take into account the effects of past trauma. So unresolved childhood trauma has a way of bubbling up whenever we're under like severe stress or something like that. So I really say it's such a preventative thing when we are brave enough to deal with our past traumas and our past experience and work through those and gain a peace and a clarity on that. So I would say the first thing that affects our mental health is our past traumas. The second thing, and this is a biggie, is the effect of our current circumstances. And I would say stress is huge. And this is something that really played a part into my own challenges when I was 28, as I was under a huge amount of stress in the sense that I had just had a baby with all the responsibilities on me, and the marriage was not healthy for me at all. And so it was very, very stressful. And I found out I was like kind of just in fight or flight all the time. That sort of stress is going to bring out mental health challenges. And so that's very important to look at the stress that we're under or what we're currently going through. The third is physical challenges can really affect our mental health. It could be something as an illness, a virus. They've actually found now that there's a connection between viruses and like even some schizophrenia and some mental illnesses that before they thought there was no connection on that. Lyme's disease, life changes, can have some physical challenge. Like for me, when I was 28, I had a baby at 27 and was still recovering from that. So that was a big physical challenge. So physical challenges definitely have a way of affecting our mental health. The fourth is the effect of nutrition. And this is very interesting because gut health, now they know, is that 90% of our serotonin actually comes from our gut health. So not having a healthy gut microbiome can hugely affect our mental health. And that's a big, huge connection. So for example, I read this example in a book recently, how a long-term schizophrenic actually really responded to a keto diet. And it was just amazing. Whereas a lot of people used to say, once you have schizophrenia, you always have it. And they're finding that that's actually not always the case. And we've got to kind of expand our view of all of that. Also, a depletion of nutrients. Certain nutrient depletion can definitely trigger mental health challenges. Or even like a toxic amount of something like mold or different things will affect our mental health. So that's huge. The interesting thing is, right before my mental challenges got really bad when I was 28, I had just taken an antibiotic, and I could tell a kind of almost a switch difference, because before I was really challenged, and then after I took that antibiotic, it was a very drastic difference for me. So that's very interesting that now they know the connection with gut health. The fifth one is physical activity. So it's interesting that they now know that having some sort of physical activity has a greater impact on depression than medication overall. And, but it's so hard when you are depressed to be physically active. I remember, because there was, times that I had depression with the bipolar, and I remember like a 2-minute walk every day, making myself do that was so much work. It was very challenging, but just doing that physical activity was just the start of that climb back up out of my mental health challenge. So definitely physical activity. 6, which is interesting, is it's least affected by genetics, which I think there's been like this a lot of correlation with genetics, but it's very interesting when we talk about like family systems, because there can be family thinking systems or family coping systems that can be passed on that can affect our mental health, but it's least affected by genetics, which is very interesting. So a big thing, and I would say this is number 7, and this is not in any specific order, by the way, is mind management. This is huge. Being how to manage our mind and training our mind is like a muscle, and being able to like train it with the thoughts and process our thoughts and process our feelings is huge. For me, during my time, I would have thoughts and I would push them aside because I'm like, I cannot think about that I'm not liking my marriage. That is like a terrible thing. Things like that, and I would not allow myself to process these feelings and thoughts that I was having. So my mind management was really, a struggle during that time. So that's number 7. 8 is habits. Our habits affect us hugely. When I talk about our habits, I'm talking about our physical habits, our mind habits, our different habits. And so healthy habits affect us in a great way as far as mentally, whereas unhealthy habits like alcohol and lots of alcohol, staying out late, can have just the opposite effects. So our habits affect our mental health a lot, and so that's one reason why I have to create very healthy mental habits, just as a protection for myself. So number 9, as far as our mental health, is our social support. To be seen, heard, and valued is a need of all of ours. To be loved and to love and be loved is essential. And when we don't have that, that can be really challenging. And we see that a lot in domestic abuse situations, because a number of times the abuser will try to isolate the situation, because then they're lacking that social support, and that's really important. And really, social support is not just hanging out with people. It's people that you can be real with, like, hey, I'm actually really struggling, and this is what I'm going through. And also having support with a mental health team, I think, is essential. I always have like a good counselor on call, a good doctor on call, a psychiatrist if needed. Just having a support system for our overall health is really essential. And of course, my naturopath is like number 1 in there. So that's the 9th thing, is social support. The 10th thing is our brain health. And this is what's so interesting. Dr. Amen has done a lot on this, because he's done a lot of brain scans, and he's a psychiatrist that is a very holistic psychiatrist now. But he always thought it was very interesting that everyone else, like, cardiologists, they look at the heart, and every other doctor looks at the organ, but with psychiatry, they didn't look at the brain. So he started doing spec imaging of the brain, which is so fascinating because he can actually see mental health problems within the brain. He can see areas where they're just lacking circulation or areas where it's too stimulated and how that affects our mental health. So that's very fascinating, is our brain health. So I always think about, like, as far as my nutrition and everything, I'm always thinking about, like, I'm eating for my brain. I'm not always, it's great to have treats and stuff, but I'm really focusing on, like, eating for my brain health. Brain injuries can have a big impact on mental health. And so it's nice because there are ways to help recover in those brain injuries. And so it's definitely worth studying that, getting some help on that. And then the 11th thing that affects our mental health is our soul health, and caring for our soul. And that's our spiritual connection with God, universe, but knowing that we have a soul, that we have a God who loves us and thinks we're amazing, and really connecting with that soul part of us. I'll tell you, in my previous marriage, my soul was dying because I was constantly in an environment where I was constantly being ignored for not cooperating with his demands. And my soul was just dying in that situation. My soul health was not good. And so soul health is, I think, something we really need to consider. So I want to end with an exercise. And this is just an exercise to help process through all of this. And so let's go ahead and get started. So take a deep breath in. And then breathe out slowly through your mouth. Take a big deep breath in through your nose. And hold it. And breathe out through your mouth slowly. I want you to keep doing that and just listen to my words. And say this to yourself. I choose to accept myself. I will not use my past against me. God, universe, help me to find the tools that I need that will serve me. Bring the lessons and messages from my past that serve me now. Help me to gain new understanding into a situation where I feel like I need more understanding. I will seek guidance from God, self, others, or however it comes. Make it a great day and grow 1% at a time. Stay tuned for our next episode.